Hello again everyone, Jessica with From Dream to Seed, and today I have a quick video on how you can successfully plan your garden. It's early February in my garden zone of 6B, and this is one of my favorite times of year for gardening, even though I'm not really gardening much at all, but I am planning my garden. And so I've had a few months off to kind of regroup and take a break from some of the hard work that comes with gardening. But this is always really exciting for me when I sort of sit down and I get out all my seeds and my notes and sort of make a map of my garden, and I plan out exactly what I would like to do for this year. And I'm actually changing things up a little bit. I'll be focusing more on flowers this year. I would really like to increase my knowledge base of growing flowers. So more videos on that to come. But for now, I'd like to give you 4 things that I always do when planning my garden, and I have found them to be very successful. So the first thing that I always do when planning my garden is I read through last year's garden journal. And if you're not keeping a garden journal, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best ways to improve your success as a gardener. And so what I do is I just keep a document on my computer and I just jot down notes all through the season. And it can be anything from when to plant things. Maybe I need to plant something sooner or later. It can be when certain pests or fungal diseases show up so that I can preventatively treat or prevent them from getting to my plants. It can be things I want to plant more of or things I want to plant less of. It can be certain varieties that did better in my garden. It could be anything from when birds started pecking at veggies, or it can be that I want to try growing something vertically. It can be anything. So I always look through my garden journal to make sure that there's nothing I'm leaving out or forgetting that will help me in planning my garden for this coming year. So the second thing you're going to want to know when planning your garden is your first and your last frost dates. So your last frost date will usually be in the spring to summer time, and for my area that's going to be around Mother's Day weekend. So this means the average last time of the year that those winter and late spring frosts will come. And then your first frost time is usually in the late fall, early winter of when the frosts start to set in. And the reason those are important is, for example, tomatoes are susceptible to frost damage. It will either severely damage the plant or even kill them. So you wouldn't want to put tomato seedlings out before your last frost date in the event that you get a late frost. And the reason knowing your first frost date is important is if you plan on doing a fall garden, you want to make sure that any plants that you plant are able to mature so that you can even harvest them before your first frost set in, or they're fully mature for things like broccoli or kale or spinach that can withstand a little bit of frost, but you do want them fully mature because usually about the time that the first frost dates are setting in, the days are shortening, the daylight hours are shortening, and that can affect the maturity of your plants. So if you're planting a fall garden, make sure that you're leaving enough time for those fall plants to mature before that first frost sets in. So now that you've read through your garden journal, or you're planning on starting a garden journal this year, and you know your first and your last frost dates, now you can decide what you want to plant. So I usually look through all of my seeds. I keep them. This is a really awesome seed storage container that my sister-in-law made me. I believe it's for photos, or you can use like index cards, but it's really awesome, and they're all neatly labeled, so thank you, sister-in-law. But I look through all of my seeds, all my veggie, all my flower seeds, and I decide what I want to plant this year. And so the few tips that I have for that are, number one, especially if you're a beginning gardener, start small. Sometimes I think we feel like we need to just jump right in and plant all these different plants, and it can be overwhelming, especially because each plant needs something specific. So if you're a brand new gardener, I would start with just a handful of things, maybe 4 or 5 things, and go from there, and make sure you're keeping notes on what worked and what didn't work. Also, make sure you're planting things that you or your family or friends are actually going to eat. So for example, every year I plant radishes because I just feel like it's something that I should plant. I don't know. But to be honest, we don't really eat them. They tend to go bad. So sorry if you do like radishes. But for us, I grow them every year and they come up really fast and they do really well, but we just don't eat them. So this year I'm kind of cutting back on vegetables. So that was definitely like first on my list to omit. So the next thing you want to think about is the season that certain plants are grown in. So typically and there are some plants that can grow in both, but usually we categorize things into cool season versus warm season plants. So in your cool season, you have things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, all your lettuces, your greens, your spinach, your kale, and onions and potatoes can be planted in that cool season, although they won't ripen until the warm season. Carrots, there's many others, but these are plants that are typically either started from seed or seedling, and they are planted sometimes before that last frost date because they can withstand those cooler temperatures. And then you have plants like tomatoes and zucchini and melons and cucumbers and, oh gosh, there's tons. Easy Google search, easily searched, cool season versus warm season plants. So you want to kind of have a plan in mind of when certain things are going to be planted. And for most gardeners, you just have like a small garden area. So what I like to do is think about how I can get the most out of that garden space. And so I have a plan. When the cool season plant is finished, I make sure that I'm never leaving that soil bare. We always want to be feeding that soil. Bare soil can leach nutrients, it can cause erosions, all kinds of things. But if you're constantly planting and feeding that soil, it's better for the soil, and then it's better produce and product and fruiting from that plant. So I always make a plan that when one harvest comes out, something else is going to go in. So for example, I will plant my onions pretty early, late March, early April, and they won't be ready to harvest until usually early July. Same thing for my garlic, around 4th of July. But I live in an area where we have a long growing season, so it will stay hot well into October. So I make sure that I have something that can go in. Now, I may not be able to put a tomato in, although I guess I could. I don't typically plant my tomatoes that late, although I could. But for example, I love sticking green beans in. These mature very fast, they germinate very fast, and they store really well. So even if I get a ton of green beans, they're easy to freeze or can. Now, for a fall garden, if you live in an area where a fall garden is possible, then I know that when my summer plants start to die back, then I have something that can go in for the fall. So, and there's some things that I only grow in the fall. For example, broccoli is one of my favorite things to grow in fall. I don't grow this in spring. For me, I have found that it doesn't do well. Our springs are so short before those hot months set in, and the broccoli always tends to bolt and flower on me. But if I grow in the fall and I plant my seedlings in, say, late July, early August, that warm weather helps the plants to mature quickly, but by the time they start to fruit and put out these flower heads, which is the part that you eat, the weather has cooled down, so I don't get as much bolting and flowering with the broccoli. So another thing I really like to do is I keep everything that I'm going to be growing in my garden this year on a spreadsheet. And I keep information about whether I'm going to start it inside, under grow lights. No, I grow everything from seed, but if you're starting things from seedlings from the store, that's totally fine too. You can still do a spreadsheet. So I have when to start it inside, when to transplant it outdoors. I have notes on if I'm going to just directly plant it in my garden. I have the maturity dates, so I know how quickly that plant will grow from seed to fruiting. Now, just a quick note, if you look on the back of a seed packet, you will see days to maturity. So for example, these beans are 50 to 65 days. That means from seed. So if you buy seedlings, know that you're going to have to knock off maybe week to maybe even 3 weeks, depending on how quickly the plant grows, off of that maturity date, because you already have sometimes a halfway grown plant, especially if you're getting like these large tomato plants. So be aware of that when you're planning your garden, that the days to maturity means from seed, after germination, I should say. So now that you know what you're planting, now you can decide where to plant that, which is really important. We don't just want to throw things in and kind of hope for the best. There are certain things that we consider when growing a garden to, number one, get the most out of the space, and number two, to make sure that we're not overcrowding or we're not underutilizing space in the garden. So for me, it's nothing really high tech. It's like using graph paper, and I kind of draw somewhat to scale bed sizes on my beds, and then I just kind of write in where I'm going to put everything. And sometimes it changes for me, especially if something's growing slower than I had planned, or maybe something didn't do well and I had to pull it. But this just gives gives me an idea of where to plant things. So there's a couple things that I consider about where to plant in my garden. So the first thing that I consider, or one of the things that I consider, are plant height. So I love to grow vertically. So there's a lot of things that I grow either on trellises, or I grow vertically, or I grow on like T-posts with cattle panel in between. And I do that for several reasons. One, my area is prone to fungal disease, and growing vertically helps create more airflow and hopefully less fungus. And two, it gives me more space. Another thing to consider is how the height of some plants can actually shade the soil and help with other plants. So stay with me. For example, one of my favorite things to grow, or plants to grow together, are carrots and tomatoes. Now, carrots are a cool season plant and tomatoes are a warm season plant, but there's several reasons why I like to grow these together. So I will start the carrots from seed. You don't usually ever, in fact, I don't think ever start carrots from transplants. I've never seen it, and I don't think they would transplant well. So carrots from seed out in the garden. And I usually start these early spring. And I leave space in between these carrots to plant my tomatoes later. So the carrots will mature, and right about the time that they're maturing, I will plop my tomato seedlings kind of in between those carrots. And so what that is going to do is, before the roots of the carrot get really, really big and kind of get in the way of the carrots, those carrots are going to come out. Then skip forward a few months, when those tomatoes, which I grow vertically, are nice and big, they are kind of shading the soil underneath, which is great because I'm going to plant a second harvest of carrots for the fall, and they like cool soil. They wouldn't do as well if I had bare soil in late July, early August. It would be hard for me to keep that soil cool enough to keep them happy. But underneath the tomatoes, they do pretty well. And so then when the tomatoes are nice and mature, I won't pull them out at risk of disturbing the carrots. I usually either just let them kind of die back on their own and keep them up, or I'll just clip them at the base. And then in the fall, I have a second germination of carrots. Another reason I like to grow these together, which is something else to consider when planning on where to plant plants, is watering needs, which is something I feel like people don't discuss enough when planting gardens. So there are some plants like carrots and tomatoes, they want deep and frequent waterings because, think about it, the carrot is the root. And so if you have deep and frequent watering, the roots are going to go where the water is and where it's cooler, so you'll get usually a longer carrot. Same thing for tomato roots. You know, when you pull up a tomato, you've got these big, deep roots. Same thing for broccoli and lots of different plants. But other things like salad greens or cucumbers even really, or melons, those roots don't really go deep. So they like more frequent but not quite as deep as tomatoes. They like more frequent watering. So I also plan on planting plants together that like similar watering. So just kind of think about the roots of those plants and what kind of watering they like, and then group those plants accordingly. So I wouldn't think twice about putting really any salad greens or kale, spinach, really anything together, because they're all going to like similar watering. So the last thing to consider when you're planning on where to plant certain plants is spacing. You will find spacing on the back of seed packets. However, I have found there are some plants that you can crowd a little bit more. So any of my spinach, kale, lettuces even really, I will plant those a lot closer together than what it says on the back of the package. I found that they do fine because the roots are not really deep. They're not really, and they're not, it doesn't have a big root system. They're not really like crowding each other. Now, other plants, especially that grow big, so for example, tomatoes, I'm probably not going to crowd those. In fact, I would never crowd those because I'm going to start having issues with fungal disease. The roots might compete for nutrients. So you want to think, the smaller the plant, usually the closer together that you can space it. The only few exceptions on small plants would maybe be carrots for me. If you're crowding those carrots, then the roots, that huge taproot, which is the part you're going to eat, may not get as big. Same thing with onions or any kind of bulbing type vegetable. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something new that will help you improve your gardening skills this year or help you plan a brand new garden. Please comment below and tell me what you're growing, because I'd love some ideas on videos to go over specific plants. If you have any questions, please let me know. And thanks again. We'll see you soon. Bye.